The dust was a living thing. It had a breath, a memory, a hunger. It rose from the cracked earth not in plumes, but in size, a fine red powder that tasted of rust and regret. It coated every surface of the broken land, clinging to the dry blades of grass, settling in the hollows of sun-bleached bone, and etching new lines of sorrow onto the face of Elias Thorne. His world was a canvas painted in shades of grit and grief. The wind, its tireless accomplice, whispered through the splintered posts of his fences, carrying not the scent of rain, but the ghosts of laughter, the echoes of a woman's song, the phantom cry of a child. Elias lived in the heart of this desolation, a man whittled down to silence and bone. He had once been built of stronger stuff, of hearty smiles and calloused hands that knew how to build, to love, to hold. Now, those hands only knew how to grip the worn leather of his reins, or how to trace the scarred, puckered skin on their backs, a permanent map of the fire that had consumed his world. The fire had taken everything. His wife, Sarah. His son, little Samuel. It had swept through their small homestead with the fury of a vengeful god, leaving behind only the blackened timber of a home and the scorched earth of a man's soul. He had fought the flames until his lungs were ash and his skin had melted, but it was a war he was destined to lose. The townspeople of Redemption had offered their pity, a shallow well that ran dry in a week. They saw the burns on his hands, the hollows in his eyes, and they saw a man haunted. Soon, their pity curdled into fear, their fear into suspicion. A man so marked by tragedy must have courted it. He was an omen, a ghost who walked in daylight, and they turned their backs as they might to a coming storm. So Elias retreated. He lived in the shell of his barn, the only structure the fire had spared. He worked his land with a grim, mechanical resolve, not to cultivate life, but to fight a losing battle against decay. His voice had withered from disuse. Words felt like stones in his throat, heavy and useless. What was there to say? The dust and the wind said it all. They spoke of absence. They spoke of an ending. He would rise at dawn, the pale, unforgiving light revealing the emptiness of his life. An empty chair by the cold fire pit. A small, rusted pail that would never again be filled by a child's hands. He would saddle his horse, a gaunt creature as weary as its master, and ride the perimeter of his failure, the broken fences a testament to a life that could no longer hold anything in. He was a man living in his own grave, breathing in the dust of his own slow erosion, waiting for the wind to finally scour him from the earth. The silence was his only companion, a vast, suffocating blanket. It was a silence born of loss, nurtured by isolation, and enforced by a town that had branded him with it. He was Elias Thorne, the man who had lost his voice, the man who spoke only to ghosts in a language of dust and wind. He did not know that another silence, a different kind of quiet, was walking toward him from the horizon, a silence that would not bury him, but teach him how to breathe again. A silence that would arrive on small, bare feet, carrying a strength he had long forgotten existed in the world. He just saw the endless expanse of red dirt, and in it, the reflection of his own profound and unending solitude. The sun bled across the western sky, a deep, wounded crimson, and Elias saw it not as beauty, but as the day dying, just as he was. She was there at dawn, a small, still form against the vast emptiness of the plains, as if the earth itself had conjured her from dust and dawn light. At first, Elias thought she was a trick of the heat, a mirage born of his lonely mind. But the shape held. He rode closer, his horse stepping carefully, sensing the change in the landscape's rhythm. She lay near a crumbling section of his fence line, curled into herself, her dark hair a spill of ink against the pale ground. A Comanche girl, no older than 10 summers, clad in worn buckskin. She was alone. There were no tracks, no sign of a tribe or family, only the faint, scuffed trail of her own small feet stretching back into the wilderness. She was an island, a solitary soul adrift in the same ocean of desolation that he was. He dismounted, the groan of his saddle leather the only sound. He expected her to flinch, to run. She did not. She simply watched him with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, ancient weariness that did not belong in a child. They were dark, lucid pools that seemed to reflect the whole of the unforgiving sky. Elias stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. His first instinct, the one conditioned by years of solitude and bitterness, was to turn away. She was not his concern. The world had taught him that compassion was a fool's currency, and he was bankrupt. But then he saw the slight tremor in her hand, the cracked skin of her lips. He saw not a savage, as the town would have, but a life flickering on the edge of extinguishment. He saw a reflection, fainter but no less true, of his own struggle. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a puff of white in the cold morning air. Without a word, he unhooked the canteen from his saddle. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and offered it to her. She watched his hands, the scarred, ruined hands that had failed to save his own family. Her gaze was unflinching. Slowly, she reached out and took the water, her small, brown fingers brushing against his burns. He felt a jolt, not of pain, but of something else, something foreign and terrifyingly familiar. A connection. She drank, long and deep. When she was finished, she handed the canteen back. Her eyes met his, and in them was a flicker of something that looked like gratitude, but it was quieter, deeper. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you." He helped her to her feet. She was weak, light as a bundle of dry sticks. He led her back to the barn, the horse following behind. He settled her on a pile of old blankets in a corner, the place least touched by the wind. He gave her a piece of dry bread, all he had. She ate it slowly, methodically, her gaze never leaving him. She did not speak. He did not speak. There were no words between their two worlds that could bridge the chasm of who they were. But in the shared space of the dusty barn, a new language began to form. It was a language of gesture and presence. A language of shared silence. She stayed. The days turned into a week, the week into a month. She never tried to leave. She seemed to understand that this broken place was, for now, a sanctuary. She began to move about the homestead with a quiet purpose, her small frame a stark contrast to Elias's heavy, grieving presence. She would sweep the barn floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, creating patterns in the dust. She would sit for hours, mending one of his torn shirts with a thread pulled from her own clothing, her stitches small and perfect. He would watch her from a distance, a knot of confusion and fear in his gut. She was bringing a semblance of order to his chaos, a whisper of life into his tomb. He did not know her name, her story, her people. He knew only the quiet dignity of her existence, the way she met the hardship of each day with a resilience that shamed his own surrender. She was a catalyst, a seed of impossible green in his barren world, and he did not know whether to nurture it or crush it under his heel before it could grow into something that might hurt him all over again. The seasons turned with a slow, grinding inevitability. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the melancholic gold of autumn. The girl remained. Elias never gave her a name aloud, but in the silent recesses of his mind, he called her Aita. He'd read the name once in a book from his previous life, a book of Comanche words. It meant to first to dance. It was a name that felt both ironic and true. She did not dance, but her presence was a kind of movement, a quiet choreography that was slowly reshaping the space around them. The homestead, once a monument to decay, began to show faint signs of life. Together, though no agreement was ever spoken, they began to mend the fences. He would dig the post holes, his muscles screaming in protest, and she would be there, dragging a new post into place, her small frame straining but her spirit unyielding. He would work the wire, and she would hand him the staples, one by one, her timing perfect, as if she could read the rhythm of his work in his shoulders. They moved in a silent tandem, two solitary figures against the vast, empty canvas of the plains. Their communication was a sparse and sacred thing. A nod from him to indicate the day's work was done. A gesture from her toward the water barrel when it was low. One evening, she found a clutch of wild onions growing near the creek bed. She brought them back and added them to the pot of thin stew he was boiling over the fire. That night, for the first time in years, the food had flavor. He looked at her across the flickering flames, and she simply met his gaze, a quiet statement of fact. "We can make things better." A flicker of warmth returned to Elias's chest, a feeling so long absent he barely recognized it. It was a dangerous feeling. It was hope. But their small, fragile world, built on silence and mutual survival, could not remain invisible forever. The town of Redemption, nestled in its valley of judgment, began to notice. Riders passing on the main trail saw the girl, a small, dark-haired figure moving about the outcast's ranch. The whispers started in the general store, slithering over sacks of flour and barrels of nails. They gained venom in the pews of the church, fueled by the righteous fire of Preacher Silas. The preacher was a man whose piety was a cloak for his cruelty. He saw the world in stark black and white, and Elias Thorne had long been cast in shadow. Now, that shadow was being shared with a savage, a heathen child. It was an affront to God, an infection that had to be cleansed. The pressure fell upon Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was as flexible as the law he was paid to enforce. He rode out to the Thorne Ranch one afternoon, his face a mask of reluctant duty. He found Elias splitting wood, Aita stacking it nearby. "Elias," the sheriff began, his voice tight. Elias stopped, resting the axe. He said nothing. "Folks are talking," Miller continued, shifting in his saddle. "They're saying you're keeping a Comanche girl out here." An orphan. Elias's gaze was flat, unreadable. He looked at Aita, who had stopped her work and was watching the sheriff with her unnervingly steady eyes. "It ain't right, Elias. It ain't decent. She belongs with her own kind. Or in an institution." Elias gripped the handle of the axe. The scars on his hands whitened. His voice, when it finally came, was a raw, rasping thing, like stone grinding against stone. "She is here," just 3 words. But they held the weight of 100 arguments. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of territory. The sheriff sighed, his resolve crumbling before the man's granite silence. "The preacher is stirring things up. Calling it a den of iniquity. Be careful, Elias. The town's fear is a dangerous animal. Don't give them a reason to let it off the leash." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread hanging in the air. Elias watched him go, then looked back at Aita. For the first time, he saw a shadow of fear in her eyes. The outside world, with its loud, hateful words, had finally breached their silent fortress. The fragile peace was broken. The pretext came, as it always does, cloaked in the guise of property and law. A scrawny calf, belonging to the preacher's brother-in-law, a man of significant influence and minimal character, wandered through a newly mended section of Elias's fence. It was a stupid, blameless animal, but in the town's fevered imagination, it became a symbol of transgression. It was the reason they needed. They came near dusk, a posse of a dozen men, their faces grim with the pleasure of their purpose. They were led by Preacher Silas, his Bible held like a weapon, and Sheriff Miller, his badge a tarnished speck on his chest. They rode into the yard, their horses churning the dust into a suffocating cloud. Elias was standing by the barn door, having just finished watering his horse. Aita was just inside, watching, her small body rigid with tension. "Thorne," the preacher shouted, his voice ringing with false authority. "You are accused of thievery. You have stolen a calf from a God-fearing man." Elias looked at the calf, which was placidly chewing on a patch of dry grass near the water trough. He then looked back at the men, his expression one of utter weariness. He had no energy left for their games, their lies. His silence was his only response. It was the response they wanted. It was an admission of guilt in their eyes, the insolence of the damned. "He won't even deny it," one of the men sneered. "The savage has taught him to be as dumb as an animal." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Now, hold on. Let's just take the calf and—" "No," the preacher interrupted, his eyes burning with zealotry. "An offense has been committed. Not just against man, but against this community's decency. A lesson must be taught." He nodded to 2 men who dismounted, coils of rope in their hands. They advanced on Elias. He did not move. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, a solitary pillar of defiance, accepting the inevitable storm. He had fought a fire once and lost everyone he loved. He would not fight this. What was there left to lose? They seized him, hissing insults as they bound his wrists. He offered no resistance. His passivity seemed to enrage them more than any struggle could have. They saw it as arrogance. Aita watched from the shadows of the barn, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was invisible to them, a creature of no consequence. They threw a rope over the high pommel of a saddle. They looped the other end around Elias's bound hands. The man on the horse grinned, a cruel, broken-toothed expression. "Let's see if the dust teaches him some respect," the preacher declared, a benediction of violence. The horse lurched forward. Elias was yanked off his feet, his body hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. They dragged him. The dust, the constant, suffocating dust of his grief, rose up to choke him. It filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. Stones and thorns ripped at his clothes and his skin. He was being erased, scoured from the land by the very men who claimed to be its righteous guardians. He closed his eyes, the memory of flames licking at him, the heat of the fire, the heat of the dust, it was all the same. It was the end. He could hear their jeers and laughter, distant and distorted, like sounds from another world. He could feel the life being scraped away from him, one brutal inch at a time. And through the haze of pain and dust, he thought he heard a new sound. It was the sound of small, bare feet stepping onto the hard ground. Out of the barn she walked. Not running, not screaming, not pleading. Aita stepped from the shadows into the dying light, a small, solitary figure moving with a purpose that seemed to stop the wind itself. The men, consumed by their righteous cruelty, didn't notice her at first. Their focus was on the broken man being dragged behind the horse, on the spectacle of their power. She walked directly into the path of the lead horse. She did not flinch as the heavy animal snorted, its eyes wide with surprise. She simply stopped, planting her bare feet firmly in the dirt, a few yards in front of it. And then, she raised her hand. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a simple, declarative act. Her arm rose, straight and steady, her small palm held flat, facing forward. It was a command. A wall of silent, unassailable dignity. The man on the horse, his face a mask of brutish glee, saw her. His grin faltered. He pulled back on the reins instinctively, his brain struggling to process the sight. A child, standing defiant, her eyes locked on his. The horse stopped. The rope went slack. Elias fell into a heap in the dust, gasping, his body a canvas of raw abrasions. A profound silence fell over the posse. Their jeers died in their throats. All eyes were on the girl. She did not look at Elias. She did not look at the preacher. She looked only at the man who held the rope, and her gaze was a weight. It held no hatred, no anger. It held something far more powerful, a mirror. In her unflinching eyes, the men suddenly saw themselves. They saw a dozen armed men, torturing a broken man, brought to a halt by one unarmed child. They saw the ugliness of their mob, the cowardice of their strength. The preacher sputtered, his righteous fury suddenly sounding shrill and hollow. "What is this? Get her out of the way. She is just enough," a voice cut through the air. It was Sheriff Miller. He stared at Aita, and for the first time, the badge on his chest seemed to carry some weight. The girl's impossible courage had found a flicker of his own. Shame, hot and profound, flooded his face. "I said, enough." He swung down from his horse. He walked over and personally untied the rope from the saddle horn. "Get out of here," he said to the man on the horse, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you. Go home." The men hesitated, their pack mentality shattered. They looked from the sheriff to the preacher, and then back to the silent, unmoving girl. Defeated not by force, but by a gesture, they turned their horses one by one and rode away, their proud posse dissolving into a group of shamed men disappearing into the twilight. Preacher Silas was the last to leave, his face a thunderous mask of indignation, but even his spirit was broken. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was clean. Aita lowered her hand. She walked to Elias and knelt beside him in the dust. She did not try to help him up. She simply waited. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, his body screaming in protest. He looked at her, his face bloody and caked with dirt. He saw not a child, but a force of nature. He saw the strength he had lost, the decency he had forgotten existed. She had saved him not with a weapon or a word, but with the purest form of courage. She had given him back his life, and in doing so, had shown him it was a life still worth living. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. Together, they walked back toward the faint, warm light of the barn, a broken man and the small, silent girl who had become his anchor, his strength, his redemption. The fire they lit that night was different. It was not the ghost of a destructive inferno, but a small, steady flame that held the darkness at bay. It was the hearth of a new and unspoken family. For what is family, if not a place of quiet acceptance? What is home, if not a hand that rises to defend you when the world wishes to drag you through the dust? If you have ever felt the weight of your own past, the sting of a world that does not understand you, if you have ever built a fence around your heart to keep the pain out, you know that the strongest walls are often the most silent. And you may learn, as Elias did, that true courage is not the loud battle cry of the mob, but the quiet, steady whisper of a soul that refuses to break. It is the hand that rises, not in violence, but in defiance of it. It is the choice to stand, to protect, to mend, even when you are surrounded by a world that only knows how to tear things down. Find that quiet strength within you. It is the fire that will see you through the night.